Now men have been made fun of for being obsessed with their own mortality and their fear of death. But what about women? What is their dark fantasy? Hi, I'm the founder of a modern Stoic philosophy, and in this episode of the Daily Stoic, we're gonna look at a fantasy that women have that they never tell you about. But before we do that, my favorite way to get into the mindset of some of these ancient philosophers is to actually roleplay them. So if you want to try that too, put on an accent, throw on a toga or whatever it is that helps you get into character, and then deliver the quote in that manner. Epicurus was trying to say something about death here. He says, "Death, the final sleep, is nothing to us. It is impossible for it to affect any of us, since we are all destined to die." Now, he probably didn't say that exactly like that. This is one of those pseudo-philosophical quotes that I could understand when they just take an ancient quote and then kind of tweak it so that it makes sense in modern English, but it's still a great quote, and it's definitely worth reflecting on. Death is nothing to us because none of us are going to be alive to experience it. None of us are going to be around to see what happens after we die. And therefore, it's a little bit silly for us to worry about it so much, right? So there are some core things to unpack here. One is that death is inevitable. You're going to die. You will not live forever. We will all die. And so we need to come to terms with that fact. There's also the idea that if death is inevitable, it doesn't really matter when it happens. Like Seneca talks about how, think about all the ways you could die. Think about the possibility of lightning striking you tomorrow as you walk outside. Well, yeah, but lightning can strike you walking outside at any point. So when you wake up tomorrow, the odds are still the same. So the idea that we get so freaked out about the future, well, death could happen at any time. So why do we fixate on some deaths and not others? And then finally, the idea that death is our ultimate teacher. And if we think about death often enough, if we meditate on death often enough, then we won't be afraid of it, and we'll be able to make better decisions today, as if we were closer to death. Now, I don't think it's necessarily healthy to think about death all day long. That might not be good. But I do think it's healthy to think about death from time to time to remind yourself that you're going to die, and to use that as a North Star to orient your life around the most important things. What I've been thinking about recently is the difference between the fantasies that men have versus the ones that women have. Men have talked about the sort of, the desire for conquest, the desire for sexual prowess, the desire to dominate other people, and there's a whole literature around the male psyche that talks about this stuff. But what about female sexuality? What is the dark fantasy that women never tell you about? And so I read this article recently by Dr. Kate White, who wrote about her experience as a gynecologist, and what she heard from her patients and what she learned about female desire. Here's what she had to say. "I think many women fantasize about sex with their fathers, and I wish more doctors would bring it up. The taboo against having this fantasy prevents many women from ever experiencing orgasm because they feel guilty or confused or disgusted by their desires, or they may even blame themselves for a lack of sexual satisfaction because they assume that it's their own fault that they couldn't reach climax." Now, I'm not sure if I agree with this assessment. I don't know enough about female sexuality to have an informed opinion on this, but I found it interesting as a take on female desire, the idea that, society makes it seem like this is disgusting, this is bad, this is wrong, and therefore women feel guilty about it, and because they feel guilty about it, they actually prevent themselves from ever being able to achieve orgasm. If you read Freud or Lacan or some of these guys, there's a lot of talk about, the Oedipus complex and how young girls want to be with their father, and how, boys compete with their father to win the mother over, and how all of this shapes our psyches. And I find a lot of that stuff to be bogus, to be honest. But there certainly seems to be something to this idea that women have sexual feelings toward their fathers, and that these are feelings that women are ashamed of, and that women don't talk about, and that they end up repressing, and that they end up feeling guilty about, and that, in turn, affects their sexuality. I know for myself, I used to feel very awkward talking about sex, and talking about my own sexuality, and talking about my body, and talking about pornography, and all these different things. And I know a lot of that was influenced by the fact that I grew up in a pretty conservative household. My parents had very traditional values, and I was not really allowed to watch TV or movies until I was older. We weren't allowed to have Playboy in the house or anything like that. We weren't allowed to talk about sex openly. I wasn't allowed to have girlfriends over. All of that stuff had a major impact on me, both positive and negative, I'm sure. But one of the negatives was that it made me kind of ashamed of my sexuality, which meant that I did not explore my sexuality early on, and I felt weird and awkward talking about it. I guess part of what I'm saying is, I do think there is some truth to this idea that women are not open about their sexuality, and that they feel guilt and shame about their sexuality in a way that men do not. I mean, there's obviously a huge spectrum here. There are some women who are hypersexualized and objectified. And I'm not talking about women who are like sex workers or porn stars or people who choose to share their bodies online. I'm just talking about regular women who feel like they have a lot of sexual desire, and that they are not allowed to talk about that sexual desire, and that because they are not allowed to talk about that sexual desire, they feel guilty or ashamed about that sexual desire. And it sounds like that's where this fantasy comes from. It comes from the idea that if I were to acknowledge this fantasy, if I were to give voice to this desire, then I would be judged by society and by other people, and therefore I need to repress it and keep it hidden and hold it inside, where it can grow and fester and cause all sorts of problems for me. We talk about female orgasming in Daily Stoic Plus. In particular, there was a recent conversation that we had with a sex therapist, who is an expert on female orgasming, and the kinds of things that men and women can do to ensure that women reach climax. And we received a ton of feedback from women in the community who were blown away by this conversation and who said, "Wow, I had no idea that this was a thing. There's a lot of information out there about how to please men, but very little information out there about how to please women. And so if you're interested in learning more about that stuff, if you want to become a better lover, if you want to learn how to touch your partner in such a way that they reach climax, then we're gonna have some great resources for you." Speaking of women and pleasure, every Friday we send out a newsletter called Weekend Wisdom that recaps the week's episodes and gives you a bunch of other resources that you can use to improve your life and get better at Stoicism. Speaking of getting better at Stoicism, if you want to get better at Stoicism, the best thing you can do is subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell. That way you get better at Stoicism every single day.